What if I told you that somewhere deep beneath the earth, there's a passage that no human was ever meant to discover? A place where the rocks themselves seem to breathe, where strange symbols mark the walls, and where something ancient waits in the darkness. This is the story of Ted the Caver, a man who found that passage in the year 2000, documented every terrifying moment online, and then vanished without a trace. His final words still echo across the internet more than 2 decades later. "I'll let you know what I find." He never did. Before we descend into this nightmare, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the stories we cover on this channel will take you to the darkest corners of the internet, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. The year was 2001. The internet was still young, wild, and unfiltered. People were just beginning to realize the power of sharing their lives online, but nobody could have predicted what was about to unfold on a simple Angel Fire website. On March 23, 2001, a man known only as Ted created a website called Ted's Caving Page. The design was basic, almost primitive by today's standards. Just a simple layout with text and photographs. But what Ted was about to share would become one of the internet's first and most terrifying mysteries. He opened with a warning that should have made everyone stop reading right there. He stated clearly that he would not reveal the real names of anyone involved, and he absolutely refused to disclose the location of what he called Mystery Cave. His reasoning was chilling. He refused to be held accountable for anyone's life but his own. What had Ted discovered that made him so protective, so afraid that others might follow in his footsteps? Ted described himself as an experienced caver, someone who had spent years exploring the underground passages near his home in Utah. Caving, or spelunking, as some call it, was his passion. There's something primal about crawling through narrow passages deep beneath the Earth's surface, about being the first person to see chambers that have existed in darkness for millions of years. Ted loved that feeling of discovery, that rush of adrenaline when you squeeze through a tight passage and emerge into a vast cavern that no human has ever witnessed. He and his friend, who Ted only referred to as B, had explored Mystery Cave many times before. They knew its passages, its dead ends, its beautiful formations. It was familiar territory, safe territory, or so they thought. In December of 2000, during what should have been a routine expedition, Ted and B noticed something they'd never seen before. In a section of the cave they'd passed dozens of times, there was a small opening in the rock face. A narrow crack, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But here's what made it interesting. Wind was flowing from that crack. Strong, cold wind. Any experienced caver will tell you that wind means something. It means there's space beyond that opening, possibly a large space, an unexplored passage waiting to be discovered. Ted and B became obsessed. They made the decision that would change everything. They were going to excavate that opening. They were going to break through and see what lay beyond. They named the passage Floyd's Tomb, a reference to Floyd Collins, a legendary caver from the early 1900s who got trapped in a tight crawl space and died there. In retrospect, Ted would later write, the name was darkly prophetic. They thought it would take a few hours of work, maybe a couple of trips to clear enough rock to squeeze through. They had no idea they were about to embark on a months-long obsession that would lead them somewhere no human should ever go. The excavation began innocently enough. Ted and B returned to Mystery Cave with hammers, chisels, and crowbars. The rock was harder than they expected, limestone mixed with tougher sedimentary layers. Every chip, every crack they made echoed through the passage. The sound was different down there, muffled yet somehow amplified at the same time. As they worked, that strange wind continued to blow through the opening, sometimes stronger, sometimes barely a whisper, but always present, always beckoning them forward. After the first few trips, they managed to widen the opening just enough to peer through with a flashlight. What they saw made their hearts race with excitement. The passage continued beyond, dropping down at a steep angle before leveling out. They couldn't see how far it went, but the wind suggested it was substantial. They were on to something big. Ted documented everything on his website, posting photographs of their progress. The pictures showed two men covered in limestone dust, grinning at the camera, their headlamps cutting through the darkness. There was joy in those early photos, pure excitement. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the depths. Trip after trip, week after week, they returned to Floyd's tomb. The opening grew larger. First, it was big enough to fit an arm through, then a head, then shoulders. The work was exhausting, brutal even. Lying on your stomach in a cramped passage, breathing in rock dust, hammering away at solid stone for hours, it takes a special kind of determination, or obsession. The line between the two was beginning to blur for Ted and B. Then something changed. Ted began to notice things that didn't make sense. On one trip, as they worked in the narrow passage, he heard something that made him stop mid-swing. It was a sound coming from deep within Floyd's tomb, beyond where they'd excavated. A low rumbling, almost like breathing, but not quite. When he mentioned it to B, his friend had heard it too, but they both tried to rationalize it. Underground passages can carry sounds for miles. It could have been water flowing somewhere deep below, or air moving through distant chambers, or just the cave settling. That's what they told themselves. But the sound continued. Every trip, they would hear it, and every trip, it seemed a little closer, a little more distinct. Ted started having trouble sleeping. He would lie in bed at night, and in the silence of his bedroom, he could swear he heard that same rumbling sound, that same rhythm, like something massive breathing in the depths below his house. It was impossible, of course. His house was miles from the cave. But the mind plays tricks when you spend too much time in the darkness. Or maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a trick at all. By late January of 2001, they had finally excavated enough of Floyd's tomb to allow a person to squeeze through. The opening was tight, claustrophobically tight, but passable. Ted made the decision to be the first one through. He would later describe this moment on his website with a mix of excitement and dread. As he positioned himself at the opening, lying on his stomach with his headlamp pointed into the darkness ahead, he felt something he'd never experienced in all his years of caving. Fear. Not the healthy respect for danger that every caver should have, but genuine, primal fear. The kind that makes your hands shake and your breath come short. The kind that tells you to turn back, to leave this place undisturbed. He ignored it. Pride, curiosity, obsession, call it what you will. But Ted pushed forward. The passage beyond Floyd's tomb was unlike anything they'd seen in Mystery Cave before. The walls were smooth, almost artificially so, as if they'd been carved rather than formed naturally. Ted's light played across the surfaces as he crawled forward, and that's when he saw them for the first time. Symbols, carved into the rock. They weren't natural formations, weren't random scratches made by animals or geological processes. These were deliberate markings, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning, language even. But they didn't match any writing system Ted recognized, and he'd studied enough archaeology and cave systems to know the common types of ancient markings. These were different, wrong somehow. The symbols seemed to twist in ways that hurt to look at. Angles that didn't quite make sense to the human eye. Ted should have turned back right then. Every instinct, every rational thought was screaming at him to retreat, to seal up Floyd's tomb and forget this place existed. But he didn't. He called for B to follow him through. Together they explored the newly discovered passage, documenting everything with their cameras. The passage descended at a steep angle, requiring careful movement to avoid sliding out of control into the darkness below. The wind was stronger here, blowing past them with a force that seemed to increase the deeper they went. And the sound, that terrible breathing sound, was no longer distant. It was all around them now, coming from the walls themselves, from the very rock they crawled across. At one point, B grabbed Ted's arm and pointed at something on the wall. More symbols. But these were different. They seemed fresher somehow, less weathered by time. And they were arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a warning, though neither of them could say why they felt that way. It was just an instinct, a gut feeling that these markings were trying to tell them something important. Go back. "Leave this place. You are not welcome here." They ignored the warning. Over the next several weeks, Ted and B made multiple trips into the newly discovered passage. Each time, they pushed a little further, explored a little deeper. Ted continued updating his website with journal entries and photographs. His writing began to change. The early entries were full of excitement and scientific curiosity, detailed descriptions of geological formations and caving techniques. But as the weeks progressed, his tone shifted. He started mentioning the dreams, terrible nightmares that plagued him every night after visiting the cave. In these dreams, he was always underground, always crawling through impossibly tight passages that seemed to constrict around him like a living throat. He could hear something moving in the darkness ahead of him, something large and ancient that knew he was there and was waiting patiently for him to come closer. He would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, with the taste of limestone dust in his mouth, even though he hadn't been caving for days. B was having similar dreams. They didn't talk about it at first, both of them too embarrassed to admit that a simple cave was affecting them so profoundly. But eventually, during one trip into Floyd's tomb, B broke down and confessed that he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere in the darkness beyond their lights, something was observing them, studying them, maybe even following them back to the surface. Ted admitted he felt it too. That sensation of unseen eyes tracking their every movement, of a presence so vast and alien that their human minds couldn't fully comprehend it. They decided to bring another person on their next trip, someone rational and grounded who could provide perspective. Maybe they were just psyching themselves out, feeding off each other's fears. Joe, a mutual friend and experienced caver, agreed to join them. Joe was the kind of person who didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. He was all about facts and evidence, the kind of guy who could talk you down from any irrational fear with pure logic and reason. They brought him to Mystery Cave, led him through the familiar passages, and helped him squeeze through Floyd's tomb into the newly discovered section. Joe's reaction was immediate and visceral. Before they'd even gone 20 feet into the passage, he stopped dead. His face, visible in the glow of their headlamps, had gone pale. Without a word, he turned around and started crawling back toward the opening. Ted and B followed, confused and concerned. When they finally emerged back into the main section of Mystery Cave, Joe was shaking. He couldn't explain what he'd felt in that passage, but he was absolutely certain that they needed to stop exploring it immediately. There was something wrong about that place, something fundamentally unnatural. He refused to ever go back, and he strongly advised Ted and B to do the same. They didn't listen. If anything, Joe's reaction only intensified their obsession. They had to know what was down there, had to understand why that passage affected people so strongly. The deeper sections of the unexplored passage became their focus. The symbols on the walls grew more frequent and more complex as they progressed. In some places, entire sections of wall were covered in the strange writing, layers upon layers of markings that seemed to tell a story, though one they couldn't begin to decipher. Ted took countless photographs, hoping that later analysis might reveal their meaning. He posted some of these images on his website. If you look at them closely, and many people have spent hours doing exactly that, there's something deeply unsettling about those symbols. They seem to shift depending on how you look at them, creating optical illusions that leave you feeling dizzy and disoriented. Some people who've stared at the photographs for too long report experiencing headaches and strange dreams of their own, dreams of endless tunnels and watching eyes in the darkness. The final entries on Ted's website became increasingly disturbing. His writing grew more fragmented, less coherent. He described experiencing hallucinations during their trips into the cave, seeing things moving just beyond the reach of their lights, hearing voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. B was affected even worse. He started refusing to go into the deepest sections, waiting at the entrance to Floyd's tomb, while Ted pressed on alone. The sensible thing would have been to stop, to accept that they'd discovered something dangerous and leave it alone. But Ted couldn't. The cave was calling to him now, literally calling. He would be sitting at work or eating dinner, and he would hear that breathing sound again, feel that pull drawing him back to Mystery Cave, back to Floyd's tomb, back to the passages that descended into the earth like a throat swallowing him whole. On May 19th, 2001, Ted made his final post to his website. The entry was brief and chilling. He wrote that he and B were planning one last trip into the unexplored passage. They'd reached a point where the passage opened into what seemed to be a much larger chamber, and they were determined to explore it fully. But things had gotten worse. The dreams had become unbearable. They were both experiencing waking hallucinations now, seeing shadows that moved independently of any light source, hearing whispers in empty rooms. B had even reported seeing a figure standing at the end of his bed one night, a tall, thin silhouette that watched him with eyes that reflected his flashlight beam like an animal's. Against all reason, against every warning they'd received both from their own instincts and from the cave itself, they were going back. Ted mentioned that they were bringing a gun, to explore a cave. When asked later by people online why anyone would bring a firearm into a cave system, there was no good answer. What could you possibly need a gun for underground? What could you shoot in the darkness that would make you safer? The implication was terrifying. Ted and B believed they might encounter something in that final chamber, something that might require more than just light and courage to face. Ted's final words on his website were simple and have haunted the internet ever since. "I'll let you know what I find." He never did. The website was never updated again. May 19th, 2001 was the last time Ted ever posted anything online. Days passed, then weeks. People who had been following Ted's journey began to worry. They left comments on his website, sent emails, tried to find any trace of what had happened to him. Nothing. Ted and B had seemingly vanished. The website remained online, a digital monument to an expedition that had gone terribly wrong. But there were no new entries, no photographs from that final trip, no explanation of what they'd found in that deep chamber. Some people tried to investigate. A group of cavers claimed to have identified the location of Mystery Cave based on the details Ted had provided and the photographs he'd posted. They believed it was a cave system in Utah, near American Fork Canyon. A few brave souls even claimed to have explored the cave looking for Floyd's tomb, but their accounts are contradictory and unreliable. Some say they found nothing resembling Ted's description. Others claim they found a passage that matched, but that it had been deliberately collapsed, filled in with rocks and debris, as if someone or something wanted to ensure it could never be explored again. The truth about what happened to Ted and B remains one of the internet's most enduring mysteries. Did they encounter something in that final chamber? Did they become lost in the unexplored passages and perish in the darkness? Did they simply decide to abandon their online presence and move on with their lives, leaving behind an unfinished story that would haunt millions of readers for decades to come? Years later, in 2008, a man claiming to be the real Ted emerged online. His name was Ted Hageman, and he admitted that while the cave exploration was based on his actual experiences, he had embellished many details for dramatic effect. The symbols on the walls, the supernatural elements, the sense of dread. These were creative additions designed to transform a real caving adventure into an effective horror story. But here's where things get interesting. Hageman's explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Some pointed out that his account of what was real and what was fiction changed in different interviews. He seemed reluctant to discuss certain aspects of the story, becoming evasive when pressed about specific details. And he absolutely refused to reveal the actual location of the cave, maintaining the same secrecy that Ted had insisted upon in the original website. If the whole thing was just a fictional embellishment of a normal caving trip, why the continued secrecy? Why the refusal to let anyone verify the location? There's also the matter of the photographs. Every image on Ted's original website was supposedly authentic, taken during actual caving expeditions. If you study them carefully, there are details that don't quite add up with Hageman's explanation. Some of the symbols visible on the cave walls in the photographs don't match any known geological formations or artificial markings. They're too deliberate, too organized to be random scratches, but too alien to be any human writing system. And then there are the faces. Multiple people over the years have pointed out what appear to be faces in some of the photographs, hidden in the shadows and rock formations, visible only when you adjust the brightness and contrast of the images. Pareidolia, the tendency for the human mind to see faces in random patterns, can explain some of this. But some of the faces are too detailed, too clearly defined to be mere accidents of light and shadow. They appear to be watching the camera, watching Ted and Bee as they explored the forbidden passages. The legend of Ted the Caver has become a cornerstone of internet horror culture. It's considered by many to be the first true creepypasta, predating even the term itself by several years. The story's structure, the use of photographs and a blog format to create a sense of authenticity, the slow build of dread, the ambiguous ending, all of these elements have been copied countless times in internet horror stories since. But none have quite captured the same feeling of genuine terror that Ted's original website evoked. Perhaps it was the timing, appearing in the early days of the internet when the line between reality and fiction was much blurrier. Or perhaps it was the passion and detail that went into every entry, the clear love of caving that shone through even as the horror elements intensified. Or maybe, just maybe, there was more truth to the story than anyone wants to admit. The cave that Ted called Mystery Cave is still out there somewhere, its passages waiting in the darkness. Floyd's tomb, if it exists, still leads to those unexplored chambers where strange symbols mark the walls and something ancient waits for the next curious explorer to venture too deep. So what really happened to Ted and Bee on that final trip in May of 2001? Did they find something in that deep chamber that changed everything? Did they encounter an entity that had been waiting in the darkness for millions of years, something so beyond human understanding that the mere sight of it drove them mad? Did they seal the passage behind them to prevent others from following? Or did they simply become lost in the labyrinthine passages, their bodies still lying somewhere, in the cold darkness, their final moments unrecorded and unknown? We may never know the truth, and perhaps that's for the best. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Some passages lead to places where human beings were never meant to go. And some mysteries are better left unsolved, their secrets remaining buried in the dark where they belong. But here's what we do know. Ted's website is still online, still accessible to anyone curious enough to search for it. The photographs are still there, still showing those strange symbols and shadowy passages. And if you stare at them long enough, if you read through Ted's journal entries late at night when you're alone, you might start to feel it too. That pull, that inexplicable draw to explore the darkness, to find out what's waiting in the depths below. You might start to dream of narrow passages and ancient chambers, of symbols that hurt to look at and sounds like breathing coming from deep underground. And if that happens, remember Ted's warning from his very first post. He refused to be held accountable for anyone's life but his own. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. Have you ever explored caves or underground passages? Have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? Something that made you question what you thought you knew about the world? Drop your stories in the comments below. This channel thrives on your experiences, your mysteries, your encounters with the unknown. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the internet's most enduring legends, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. We've got more dark stories coming, more unsolved mysteries, more journeys into the places where reality blurs and nightmares begin. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and whatever you do, if you ever find a narrow passage with strange symbols on the walls and a cold wind blowing from the depths, maybe just seal it back up and walk away. Some doors were meant to stay closed. Some passages were meant to remain unexplored, and some mysteries should never be solved. This is your host signing off. But remember, the darkness is always waiting, always patient, and always hungry for the next curious soul brave enough or foolish enough to venture too deep. Sweet dreams.